Hello, U.S. history. Welcome back. We left off on Monday at the Declaration of Independence. In our review this week of U.S. history up to 1877 that we're kind of blowing through, we left off on July 4th, 1776, when the colonies decided to declare independence from their mother country, the British Empire. Now, it's not like the British king is just going to roll over and let them go. No, he's going to fight back. He's not just going to let these rebels leave his empire. And so he's going to send armies and navies across the Atlantic Ocean to fight these traitors. And that's going to lead to the American Revolutionary War. It begins, remember, in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, and it's going to run about 8 years until we get to the Siege of Yorktown in 1783. Now remember, this is a huge upset. It is entirely improbable that this little group of farmers in the colonies, these American rebels, would defeat the greatest empire of the time, the British Empire, that had the most powerful army and navy in the world. This is entirely improbable. But the Americans are able to win really for there's several reasons, but we'll boil it down to two. First, they successfully wage a war of attrition, meaning that they are able to survive long enough, right, and keep the fight going until the British decide it's not worth it to fight anymore. It's getting too expensive because war is incredibly expensive. So that's the first reason. Second, we don't win this war, most likely, without help from our allies across the Atlantic Ocean, the French. The French are the arch rivals of the British during this time and for hundreds of years before and after this. And they come help us when we ask them for help. And they send supplies and money and ships to come help the Americans in their cause against the British Empire. So those are the two reasons we're able to win this war. And the war ends at the Siege of Yorktown, where really the last major army under General Cornwallis surrenders to Washington, George Washington, and the French fleet at Yorktown. That's really where the war ends. Now, everyone's super excited in the United States at this time because they've just won their independence. Well, most people are excited. There are still some people loyal to Britain. They're going to have some awkward lives now. But the Americans are going to have a realization. Just like when you move out of your parents' house, when you turn 18 or you move out when you're 30, it's totally up to you. But when you do end up moving out, you're going to have all this freedom and all this independence, and you can go to Taco Bell at 3 in the morning. It's completely up to you, right? You have all that freedom. However, you also have the responsibility of taking care of yourself. You have to get up in the morning, you have to go to work, you have to pay your own bills, and that's the same realization that the American people are going to have. When they get rid of the British Empire, they're excited to have all this freedom and independence and self-government, but they also realize they have to govern themselves. They have to create some kind of government that's going to create a stable economy and a government system that's going to benefit everyone, and so that they can survive as a country. And so their first attempt at doing that is a complete failure. The Articles of Confederation was their first government. Now, it wasn't all bad. Let's look first at the good. Under this government, the government could sign treaties. Well, that's a good thing, right? Because we're going to end up signing a treaty with France to be our ally in the war. Second, this government created a national army and a navy. Now, that's going to be useful to us in winning the Revolutionary War against the British. And third, it's going to pass the Northwest Ordinance, which is going to set up a process for new territories in the future to become states. That's going to allow us to grow into the West. And finally, it's going to be able to negotiate and sign the Treaty of Paris. So this government wasn't all bad. However, the bad does end up outweighing the good. On the bad side, this government had no power to tax. So the first American government, we didn't give them the power to tax because we had a really bad experience with the British government when it came to taxes. And so we made the government weak because we had an experience with a strong government, with the British Empire, a monarchy, and we didn't give them the power to tax. We also put in this document that all 13 states had to approve any changes. Now, it's hard to get 13 people to agree on what to eat for dinner, much less how to change a government. It's hard to get 2 people to agree on what to eat for dinner, but that's a side issue. Third, no executive or judicial branches. So this government only had one branch, the legislative branch, and their job was to make laws and pass taxes. The problem is you've got no executive branch to enforce the law, to make sure that the laws and taxes are carried out. And you also don't have a judicial branch to interpret what the laws mean. So those are bad things. I should probably use more selective vocabulary than good or bad, but you get the point. Shays' Rebellion. This was a rebellion of farmers in Massachusetts that started to grow, and it scared the American people because they realized that if that government did get out of, or sorry, if that rebellion got out of hand, this government was not going to be strong enough to stop it. So that was a problem. And finally, this government had no power really to get states to do anything together. It had no power to regulate the states to honor their obligations. So ultimately, this government's going to fail miserably. As we can see here, the poor Articles of Confederation sitting there, a total failure, as all the American people yell at it and tell it what's wrong with it. So kind of sad, but that's all right. So that leads to second attempt at government. So the American people decide to send representatives to Philadelphia. 55 men, of course, show up in Philadelphia from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island decides not to show up for several reasons. But in 1787, in the hot summer heat, these guys are going to figure out what we're going to do. How are we going to survive as a country? How can we fix our government? And so in 1787, they decide to redo it completely. Now think about that. We got 55 guys in this room. They're not going to be able to agree on everything. But there are some things that they do agree on. First, they agree that the purpose of government should be to protect individual rights. That should be the central pillar of our government. Second, they also believe in popular sovereignty, in the consent of the governed, in a social contract where people give their permission to the government to rule over them and maintain law and order. They also believe in generally how the structure should look. They believe in what's called a constitutional republic that will have a document, a constitution that will serve as the law of the land, and that the people will elect representatives to govern for them. That's what makes it a republic. So it's going to be a constitutional republic. But there are going to be some issues that they don't agree on that we're going to have to work out. The first issue that we had to work out at this constitutional convention is how many votes is each state going to have? You know, if all the states are going to send representatives and they're going to vote on laws and taxes and all these things in the future, how many votes does each state get? There are going to be two proposals at this convention. First, the New Jersey plan. This plan was very simple. Every state will get the same amount of votes. So 1 vote per state, or 2 votes per state. Another plan, however, was the Virginia plan. So states like Virginia and Massachusetts, who had larger populations, they believed that since we have more people, we should get more votes. So we have a problem here. So we have a problem between large populous states and smaller, less populous states. So we got to figure out how to come to a compromise. So the first compromise is called the Great Compromise. And this is going to create what's called a bicameral Congress. So bicameral just means 2 chambers. And what this sets up is, you know, we're trying to figure out New Jersey or Virginia plan. Should it be equal or should it be based on population? So we end up doing a little bit of both. So we create a U.S. House of Representatives where the number of representatives each state gets is going to be dependent on population. So that's the Virginia plan. On the other side, we're going to create a Senate where it's going to be equal. So if you're New Jersey, you get 1 vote, and if you're Virginia, you get 1 vote, or 2 votes each. So we create a bicameral Congress that's going to work together to check and balance each other and check and balance the power between large states and small states. But we still have a problem. If we're going to end up counting the people in each state to determine representation in the House of Representatives, our next problem is, should we count slaves? Because remember, at this time, slavery is very much a thing. It's a huge part of our economy, unfortunately. But we have to work out, are we going to count slaves? You got to remember that most Americans back then, saw slaves as a lesser human being. They saw black people as being less than white people. And so for a lot of people, it didn't make sense that we would count slaves. However, if you allow states to count their slaves, then they get more votes. So the compromise we came to, because northern states that don't have a lot of slaves were saying, look, we don't want you to be able to count your slaves. That doesn't make any sense. You don't think they're people. And southern states are saying, no, we're going to count our slaves. They live here, they count. And that would give them more votes. So the compromise is one of the most despicable things that they came up with at this constitutional convention. And that's called the 3/5 compromise. Basically, the way this would work is, yes, states with slaves will be able to count their slaves, but the slaves will only count for 3/5 of a person. So in other words, every 5 slaves we count will count for 3 people. That was the compromise we came to. And by the way, that is still in the Constitution. It still says in the Constitution that we'll count a state's population and 3/5 of what's called other persons. And back then that meant slaves. Now it doesn't mean anything because slavery is no longer part of our economy. So that's the second issue. Third issue, real quick, was, we're going to put one person in charge of the executive branch, which they also debated about for like 4 months because they'd had a really bad experience with one person being in charge of anything, and that was King George. And so this was kind of an awkward issue. But once they decided that, yeah, we can put one person in charge of one branch because we're going to have 3 branches. So how do we choose the chief executive? Should it be, should Congress just choose one person to be in charge of the executive branch, or should we let the people vote for president? And what we ended up coming up with was a system called the Electoral College. So in this system, we won't go into too much detail here, but in this system, yes, the people vote, but each state is worth a certain amount of points. So in Texas, for example, if one person wins the state of Texas, they get all 38 of those points. And you're trying to get over half of the Electoral College points. If there's any confusion about that, we can talk about that later. But that was the compromise they came to, and we can see that playing out in elections today. This is the 2016 election that Donald Trump won because he had more electoral points. But you can see on this little box here that even though he had less popular votes, less people voted for Donald Trump, he was able to win because he got more electoral points. That's happened several times throughout U.S. history. So those are the kind of the compromises that we came to. When we wrote this document, the U.S. Constitution, that begins with 3 very powerful words: we the people. Because remember, it's all about the idea that people are giving their permission to the government to be in charge. Now, the preamble, the first paragraph of the Constitution goes like this: we the people of the United States, and this is the purpose, this is why we created this document, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So this is why they're creating this document. Now, one more thing here. They're going to create this government based on 7 principles. These are incredibly important. You'll probably remember these from 8th grade. The 7 principles of the U.S. Constitution. The central pillar, the thing that everything else is based on, is individual rights. The belief that human beings have rights, and it's the government's job to protect those rights and not infringe on them. We still believe that very much. That's why there's so much of a disagreement about wearing masks, because some people say that, well, it's my right to not wear one, right? So individual rights, one of our central pillars. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the right to bear arms, freedom of speech, all those fall under that pillar there. Another principle is limited government. We don't want the government to become too powerful, so we're going to limit its power in order to protect individual rights. We're going to limit the power of the government by separating power. We're going to have 3 branches of the federal government: legislative, executive, judicial, and then we're going to have a federal level, we're going to have a state level, we're going to have a county level. We're going to have all these different separations of power in our government to limit the power of the government. Popular sovereignty, the idea that the people are in charge of the government. The people rule. Donald Trump's boss is you when you turn 18. The president's boss are the people. Congress's boss are the people. Checks and balances, the idea that each branch of government, all the different layers of government will check and balance each other so that no one person or group becomes too powerful. Federalism is another principle. The idea that we're going to have a national government over all the states, but that all the states are also going to govern themselves in a lot of ways. And then we have, that should say republicanism, my apologies. So federalism and then finally republicanism. And republicanism is the principle that we elect representatives to govern for us. So these 7 principles are really important. So as you're taking your quiz over this video, I've created a cheat sheet for you to use. You are allowed to use this sheet while you take the quiz and interact with the ways these principles play out in our government. So the U.S. Constitution, obviously, is still in place today, 240 years later, right? Written and adopted 1787 to 1789. And we still use it today. Actually, I think that's 231 years later. But this is still our government today. We still believe in all the things that this Constitution set up. And it's the law of the land. It's what governs us. That's where we're going to stop today. And then we'll pick up on Friday with a video that hopefully will be shorter than this. I keep going too long. Where we will pick up from here and go all the way through the Civil War. And I'll try to limit that video to 10 minutes if possible. Thank you guys.